So very clearly we have animals, specifically wildlife, in common. And we were chatting with each other beforehand to try and figure out what other things we might have in common. I'm happy to say that we've all written children's books. That's like the big thing apparently we have in common. And of course we grew up with nature. Our Krithi and Janaki and Stephen apparently have animals for family, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So I want to start with you, Krithi, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you got interested in wildlife or ecology or conservation. And I say this from the point of view of a kid that grew up in a city, went to a school with a small playing field, one tree, and a healthy fear of geckos, which I'm sure I share with many people in the audience. And wildlife and nature and ecology hit me much later in life, but I know that you grew up around an ecologist, your father, and several others, and had your experiences started very young. So perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about that.
So I don't think I actually had a choice. My father started taking me to the jungle when I was a year old, and I'd seen my first tiger and leopard by the time I was 2. I would, when my mom had to travel on work, she would often leave me with him, and I didn't really appreciate the extraordinary opportunity that he gave me. I kind of thought I didn't have a choice, and so we would spend a lot of time in watchtowers, and like most other kids, I wasn't allowed to take anything in. And 6 hours of sitting in a watchtower trying to spot an animal before he did, a bird before he did. And the only thing I would wait for was actually the safari ride at the end of the evening. And I didn't consciously want to do what he did because he is so extraordinary in so many ways. So I rebelled against it, and I think I truly fell in love with wildlife and wild places when I was doing my master's fieldwork many years later in Badra. So I think that childhood was amazing, but it's only now that I'm actually appreciating the gift that my dad gave me. So.
Yeah, well, then there's hope for my son, you think. Grew up with people, wildlife biologists around him, and he'd look at a goat on the road and go, tiger. So, well, I'm glad to hear there's hope. Janaki, so when I met Janaki 25 plus years ago, she was an aspiring filmmaker and was working with a film company that had nothing to do, I think, with wildlife at all. But pretty much since then, she's been sort of again dragged into the world of nature and ecology, and particularly appealing ones like snakes, not to mention king cobras. So perhaps you can. Would you like to tell us, how your journey into this field?
Yeah, it was completely the opposite of Krithi's. I'd never seen a wild animal throughout my growing up years. To me, nature was what was in the backyard in my city home, which was one big mango tree, basically, that was it. Or if I went to my grandparents' home in the village, it was the rice fields, that was nature. And crows and kingfishers were all the wildlife I knew. So I think we were 21 when Kartik was a student, and in the Chennai has the Student Sea Turtle Network, group of students who walk the coast of the city to help sea turtles evade egg poachers and other predators. So that was my first real view of something that wasn't the normal. And the first forest I stepped into was much later, when I was 23, 24, when I met Rom. And he dragged me to Agumbe. I mean, what a forest to drop someone who's never been in a forest before. It was just raining, cats and dogs, everything was wet. There were leeches everywhere. I hated it. I thought, this just sucked. I really disliked it. And it took a long time for me to get used to the whole idea of what is there to appreciate in a forest. I mean, why would people do this? So I think it took me a long time to get there.
Yeah, when Janaki and I reminisce, as she said, I was in college and we'd go across to the Madras Crocodile Bank, and on one of those trips on the way back, a snake sort of went across the road, and I stopped the bike, lever holding it, and dashed into this casuarina grove. I knew it was either a cobra or a rat snake, and go sprawling and catch it, and it was a rat snake, and I bring it back, and Janaki is just staring at me, going, "Why do all of you herpetologists have to grab every animal you see?" And now she knows. After
I don't. I don't.
Okay.
Why do you have to? No, actually, I wasn't impressed with you going after the rat snake. He left me holding the scooter, and I didn't know the first thing about riding a scooter. And this thing would, I moved my wrist a little bit, and it was starting to go forward, and I was so petrified of shooting off in the scooter. That's all I was worried about.
So, Steve, you and your family, you've sort of engaged with nature. You've had a love for nature and wildlife and animals, and you've been writing about it for 40 years, 40 plus years now. Could you tell us a little bit about your childhood growing up and what brought you onto this path of, in particular, writing about it, as a way of expressing your love for it?
Sure. Thank you. I was very, very fortunate to grow up in Missouri. I was born in Missouri, and we lived at the edge of town, so our home was surrounded by forests. So I was fortunate to grow up within an environment that was full of wildlife, full of bird life. And our family holidays, my parents always enjoyed going out camping, and in those days we would go for 2 weeks to Corbett National Park and reserve one of the bungalows. And so that was my idea of a holiday. And coming back home, there was wildlife all around us. I mean, we had yellow-throated martins in our attic, and we had jackals in the ventilation shafts under the house and things like that. So the animals were all around us. We didn't have frogs in the bathroom like you do. We had spiders and things like that. But I think there was an awareness at that point that you had to live in concert with nature. And nature isn't something that you close the door on. It's going to get in one way or the other. And so you might as well make your peace with these creatures and figure out how you can share the space together. As I began writing, I think all of my books have had an element of nature in them, but it was really only in the last 10, 15 years that I realized that was one of the primary focuses of my work. And I began to think about that consciously and, in a sense, see myself as a nature writer. And one of the things we often think of nature writing as something that is a nonfiction genre. It's something that, you go out, see a tiger, you write about it, you interpret it, you wrap some stories around it, and then you present it as a piece of observation, whether it's scientific or amateur or whatever it might be. But what I've come to realize is that nature writing crosses all genres, and you can write a novel that comes under the category of nature writing. You can write for children, you can write poetry. There are many, many different avenues to take your nature writing in. And I think that's something that, once I realized that, I suddenly realized, great, I don't have to restrict myself to a first-person narrative that's going to simply tell people which trees I saw on my walk today. I can put in a fictional world and then use that as the scenery, the backdrop, and in some cases the subject itself. So more and more I find that the experiences I had as a child are now informing the books that I write as an adult. And I think that is a rich reservoir to draw on, because some of our earliest, I'm sure, Krithi, your earliest memories, even if you rejected them for a while, they're still something that come back to you with a great amount of poignancy and a huge amount of meaning.
So let me continue on that, on that train of thought. By the way, I wanted to tell you guys that the pleasantries are over now, and yes, we're going to get tougher as this go along. The real panel begins now. But let's start with the simple one. I mean, you talked about writing both fiction and non-fiction, and so one of the questions that I'm asked by journalists when they write asking me about the fiction that I write is, are you trying to send a message out? And so let me ask that question. With a lot of non-fiction writing, to a certain degree, there is very explicitly a message sending. We write non-fiction about nature, wildlife, and conservation because we want to share an observation, share an experience, very often even share an opinion. Right? Does that extend to the work that you specifically do with your fiction as well? For you personally, is there a greater pleasure in one over the other, or what are sort of the differences across the genres?
Yeah, very very quickly. I think there is a purpose. I think in any kind of writing, there's a purpose. Sometimes it's an overt strategy that you're putting out there to try and convince people of something. Sometimes it's less overt and sort of under the surface. But for instance, I'll just give two quick examples. I wrote a children's book called The Secret Sanctuary, and that had a very, very specific purpose, which was there was a small nature reserve very close to my home called the Jabbercape Nature Reserve, which is 100 acres of land adjoining a larger government forest. And we had a number of school groups coming there, and they would walk through there, but they needed some sort of story to inspire them, because otherwise they were dragging their heels and they're saying, all you've showed us is one whistling thrush and a couple of butterflies, and this isn't very exciting. So by writing a story about that sanctuary and adding some magic and mystery to it, I tried to kick their imaginations into another realm and allow them to see that sanctuary as a magical place, as a place of inspiration, and a place that ultimately, if you're talking about strategy, is a place that should be protected.
Right. But, guys, feel free to jump in if you have an opinion. But I'm going to...
Could I interrupt?
Yes, please do.
That's one thing I don't like to do, give a message. Because when I read, it spoils my experience, and I think it spoils the experience for other readers. So if I'm narrating a story, people can take from it whatever they want. They're free to do that. But doing this message somehow I don't know, I just rebel against that. I just wanted to put that in because it's also possible to write without having an overt message.
Right, and I want to ask, continuing on the theme of fiction, I want to ask if, in a way, answering the question for myself, I said the first book I wrote was it was a lark. I mean, someone said, "Why don't you try it?" And I said, "Sure," and I enjoyed it. I feel it's an addiction. I write children's books because fundamentally I enjoy them. And my question to novelists is, or to the not just the two of you, but the larger sort of community is, would there be more nature writing if people were just choosing this because it was fun for them to do as writers, and not just the folks, even though, Janaki, you say you don't want to send a message, the four of us here are people with a message, right? What if the nature writing genre were to spread beyond people such as us to people that were writing about it because it was another fun genre to write in, just the way that sci-fi or fantasy fiction is? Is that something that you think that we should be, actively promoting?
I think so, and I think that the message, again, doesn't have to be in your face. It can be submerged beneath a lot of things. I think one of the experiences that I've had in the book that I've been working on recently, which is a nonfiction book, but what I've been able to do is include a lot of folklore that relates to nature. And so one of the jobs in my research was to go out and find as many stories about animals and wildlife that I could, so that when I observed that animal in the wild, then I could tell the story about it. And Barry Elwin's Myths and Folklore of the Northeast is a spectacular book in terms of finding stories about animals and birds as well. There's a wonderful folk tale about the most beautiful bird in the Northeast, and it was so beautiful and it thought so highly of itself that it wouldn't marry any of the other birds. And then ultimately in the dark, the bat comes, and the bat whispers endearments in the bird's ear, and they become lovers until the dawn breaks, and then it sees the bat, and of course then it starts abusing the bat and saying, who are you, you ugly thing, and all that. And that's why the bat hangs its head. So stories like this, I think, bring a certain magic to these species, which have a magic in and of themselves, but these bring them to life in so many ways.
That's a very deep parable, Steve. you know.
So I think what I find fascinating is that all of us, we've put a lot of energy into children's books, and for me, I think I've spent 20 years writing scientific articles and popular versions of scientific articles, but when I made that decision to write a book, it was a children's book, and it wasn't a non-fiction or fiction novel. And it was fundamentally because I feel like if you look at children's books in India, they are celebrating animals from across the world. There's very, very few children's books, and I'm glad the numbers are growing, that celebrate our wildlife, right? And our kids know about kangaroos, they know about giraffes, they know about zebras, they don't know about the lion-tailed monkey, they don't know about gliding frogs, and all this spectacular wildlife we have from 2-3 hours from Bangalore. And for me, it was very much, why do we not have pride in our animals? Why do our kids not celebrate our wildlife? And I think that connect is really, really important as well, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think Krithi and I are both involved with environmental education programs, and we, in very different locations, we work with young children from rural and sort of marginal communities, and these kids have never heard of a bird or a mammal or any wild animal that lives even a few kilometers from their home. They are still taught G for giraffe and, as you said, K for kangaroo. If you're ever driving down the road to Coorg, to Madikere, or so, there's somewhere on the, I think it's before Hassan, or just after Hassan, there's a roadside shop which has like these sculptures and like whatever clay things. And amongst the animals that they have are near life-size giraffes. And it's the most surreal thing. You're driving out of Coorg and you see these giraffes by the side of the road. And it's really, for me, it kind of symbolizes the way we think about wildlife in this country. But Krithi, let me ask you one more question. And I'm, fortunately for you, but unfortunately for us, you're the only one here with young children at this time. So as a parent, if you were to go out, looking for books that they would really enjoy, as a parent, right, not as a wildlife professional, would you be looking for books with a message, or would you be looking for just the things that, the coolest books for the kids?
For me, it's color, it's art, it's it's the visual appeal, and I think the simplicity of the story, often not bombarding scientific information. This is what monkeys do and this is what elephants do, but really making characters come alive. And I remember as a child, my grandfather, who was an extraordinary writer. I mean, he wrote 419 plays and novels and many children's books. He would call us to his room at night and make his 3 youngest grandkids sit down and say, what would you like a story about? And we'd make up animals, and that night's story would be about that particular animal. Unfortunately, we never recorded these stories, but we're losing oral storytelling. We're kind of heavy on the visual part of it. This particular book that we just launched here today is a book that's in Kannada and English, because that's the other thing that worries me, is that we're getting so anglicized, and we need books in, this book that we did is in Kannada and English, and we need to do it in, English and Tamil and English and Hindi, so that kids I mean, most kids, my kids, I'd be amazed if they spoke one other language other than English. And we speak 4 or 5 languages. Our grandparents' generation spoke 9 languages. And you're seeing languages also disappear. So I think it's storytelling, it's fun, it's art, but it's also keeping some of these languages alive along the way as well. So.
Yeah, hold it up for a minute.
Sorry. It's called Nanna Jote Artiya in Kannada, or Will You Play With Me? And we got a grant from National Geographic. I worked with an artist, brilliant artist, Raghava KK, and the purpose is this book is going to be given 10,000 copies for free for children living next to parks across Karnataka. Then we will do it in Tamil and Marathi and Hindi. The book is actually not going to be sold. The only purpose is to kind of reach the children living in high conflict villages who perceive tigers and elephants and other animals very differently than some of us do.
Thanks, Krithi. Your hand. Is that your first book?
Yes, I'm hoping this was too much fun.
418 to go to catch up with your grandfather.
I don't think I will.
Yes. Well, I just discovered that Prabha Malia, who did the background, has also worked with. She's done Steve's books, she's done my books, and she's done Janaki's articles. So we found these little lovely threads. I think one of the other things that going down that particular road is we've also all done illustrated books, and worked with some of the same, but also many different artists. And one of the things that I'd like to ask you guys is, I'm assuming that we all did some writing before we worked with an artist and did an illustrated book for the first time. How did your view of writing, or how did your view of constructing a book, whether it was fiction or non-fiction, how did that change in working with someone from a completely different domain? On that scale of things, scientists are considered to be absent-minded professors. Writers are considered to be even more flaky. Artists are, of course, considered to be further down along that spectrum, right? So we all occupy some point in that spectrum of flakiness. I have my own sort of observations to share, but I'll ask the panelists. I'll ask Steve, Janaki. How was it like? What was it like to work with an artist for the first time, and what did it change for you about writing after that?
Well, I was first a filmmaker, so I thought visually, and when I write, I think visually too. So it wasn't that big of a leap for me, and so the book I did was with Maya Ramaswamy, and so it was. I think she found it easier. She just said, this is what I plan to do. Do you have any suggestions? And it was exactly what I had in mind. So it was not a big adjustment to make.
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is I think the book that Krithi's just brought out is terrific, and it's a perfect example of how you can get a message across without hammering someone over the head with it. I mean, it's a book about playing. It's a monkey that wants to play with various animals, and that idea that somehow wildlife can be non-threatening comes across. I've only seen it in less than an hour, but it's very effective, and I think that is the kind of storytelling that works both with the images and the words fitting together. I think for me, I wrote my stories long before the illustrator was brought in. So I had already, gone through multiple drafts, and then the publisher sent it to Prabha Malia. I've never met Prabha. I've exchanged one email with her. But what was very exciting was, as a writer, you're trying to make your audience see the world through your own eyes, or at least through a parallel vision of your own. And so when you're writing about something, you're constantly observing, whether it's wildlife or trees or whatever it may be, and you observe it partly as a scientist, but partly as an artist, as a creative person in that way. And I think the most important thing is you don't want to get it wrong. Because the minute you get something wrong, for instance, if I say a barking deer is green, and in fact a barking deer is rusty red, I've already lost my audience at that point. So your observations have to come true on the page. What was very exciting about sending it to Prabha was that then she came back with illustrations from my story. And I can say with complete confidence they matched my image of what those moments were from the book. The funny part about it is my book has an elderly naturalist who wanders around this thing. And there's a picture, everybody who sees it, they say, but that's you. So, and she's never met me, and I don't think she's ever seen a photograph of me, but somehow I'm appearing in this book as well. So when it works with an artist, it works really well. And I think it becomes a sort of mutual collaboration in that way.
Yep. So Prabha Malia is the artist that we're talking about, who's worked with all of us, as well as with on the new edition of Vikram Seth's Beastly Tales, and she's fairly accomplished. She's won several awards. I have a really interesting story. When we started working on the novel together, I actually started working on it because she showed me illustrations that she'd done for a different book, and she said, "This is the style that I'm working on. Why don't you write a longer form novel and not just the picture books?" I shared it with another ecologist, just the text, and reading my text reminded her of books, the series that Prabha Malia had actually illustrated. So I felt like the words were sort of wrapping themselves around an illustration style for this completely new person to be able to connect, to say that this book reminded me of that one, when I hadn't read the other novel, so I had no idea what the book was about. But just based on the link of the style itself was sort of wrapping an illustration around it, which was a fairly novel experience for me. I draw very badly, so unlike you, Janaki, for me the visual sense was completely lacking until and I hadn't made films. So I think for some of us, working with the artist was itself a sort of a transformative experience. You've just finished your first book, so.
Well, with us, I think my mission was find signature animals of the Western Ghats, take it off. I mean, we have a tiger cub and we have an elephant, but we have frogs, we have monkeys, we had to diversify to make sure we're kind of capturing even the neglected ones, the less charismatic ones. And then Raghava just brought the characters to life. So we did it the other way. We brought the characters to life, and then we wrote a story on how do we bring all of these guys together in a sense that makes it fun for a child to read.
Right. That's brilliant. I mean, that's the way to do it. And I think that in some of the work that we're doing with art and science, we're trying to create stories where the artist and the scientist start at the same time, and not, as you said, you finish writing the article or the story, and then the artist starts later. I also sort of wanted to sort of emphasize one of the something that both of you said about language, and I think we're losing a lot of stories, and we're losing a lot of cultural nuance in when the local languages are sort of as they disappear and sort of English swamps them all. So I'm always delighted to hear that when stories are translated. Was King Cobra's Tale also done by Pratham, Janaki? So that must have been translated into a dozen 4 languages. A couple of the books that I've done with Pratham books as well, 6, 7, 8 Indian languages, and that in a way it really feels that you're actually then reaching out to a much larger audience. I want to change gears a little bit over here. We've sort of, despite my threats, we've remained in the milk and honey zone. I'm going to, we've got the two of us here. I'm a moderator, but I'm generally not known to be very moderate, so more of an immoderator, if you will. 2 of us here are scientists, and 2 of you are not. Huh? 2 plebs and 2 scientists, strange people. As we've talked through this, one of the assumptions that that people make in a lot of communication of science and nature and so on is the role of scientists, right? In fact, one of the things about science and society is a lot of science remains in these relatively unreadable, sorry, Krithi, unread, I write those things too, unread scientific journals, scientific papers. If you're really successful, your paper will have, a few hundred citations. If you're extraordinarily successful, a few thousand. But our children's book, Krithi just said she's making 10,000 copies. The Pratham books that Janaki and I wrote have probably sold 10,000 plus copies. Steve's books must have sold, hundreds of thousands of copies by now. But
No, don't believe it. Don't believe it.
so, but however you phrase it, what we're doing for the popular audiences are reaching far, far more people than not. My question is, what the hell are scientists doing? What do we need them for? I mean,
You still need science. You can't.
why?
We need to know how the world works. Come on.
So in the communication of let's not be milk and honey about this. Let me, as the scientist, take the provocative view that all of the wonderful stuff that you guys are writing and communicating would have been possible without us.
I thought you were going to be provocative and say, "Why the hell do we need writers if we've got scientists?" I mean, you're being very gentle on the rest of us. But let me just throw it. Let me throw it back at you.
I'm coming to you guys next.
No, I think that each of us, I'm sure Janaki does, and I do also. We have a stack of field guides on our desk. We have a stack of research material that we've gathered over the years. That's what we draw upon. I mean, one of the great American nature writers, Annie Dillard, someone asked her a question once about, how do you know all this stuff that you put in your books? And she said, I look it up. I go to the library and I look it up. And so what scientists have been able to do is they provide us with this enormous resource of information that then we go and pick and choose from. Now, having said that, I'll be a little bit confrontational in that way. I think science often, the problem with science and many scientific reports or analysis of whether it's a wildlife issue or a climate change issue, it sets human beings apart from the rest of nature. And I think that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that we as human beings have done, is we forget the fact that we are a species too. And we're a species that has to interact with other species as well. We are not some super species. We're not some, yes, we're smart. Yes, we can write. Yes, we can do all of that. But at the end of the day, when it comes to our own survival and our own place in nature, we have to recognize that we are part of nature. We're not apart from nature. And I think that a lot of scientific writing does, if not overtly, it does, in a sense, place us as the observer and then the observed. And I think that writers like Janaki, myself, and so many other nature writers are trying to reconnect our species to the other species that we interact with. And I think if we can do that with all of the accumulated knowledge that we get from folks like you and your colleagues, I think that then we can really excite people's imagination to live with those animals, play with those animals, protect those animals in that way. So that's my only quarrel with science, is too often it seems to sort of separate itself from nature, whereas I wanted to sort of plunge in and engage with other species on an emotional level, on a philosophical level, and so many other levels as well.
Janaki's books are called My Husband and Other Animals. The second one just came out. Go out and buy them both. But the title itself sort of, in some sense, resonates with what Steve was saying, that you're sort of trying to blur the sort of the distinction that one has often made between the human world and the natural world.
Yeah, so I actually want to talk to a point we made earlier about whether there should be a message or not. So when you don't have a connection with nature, then no matter what message you give, it's not going to work. So I see my role as doing that connection, of establishing that connection between people and wildlife and, non-human creatures. And I think that is fundamental. And after that, you can say anything. It's already there. I think once they form that connection, they already know the rest of it. You don't have to say, oh, you have to protect the lion or the elephant or the tiger. I think it will come. Am I making sense?
I think with science has kind of given me a lot of insights because I've worked on human-wildlife conflict for almost a decade now across India. What science has actually surprised me with is that we talk about communities in India being very tolerant of losses, and the evidence for that has built. We've done 10,000 surveys across India. You find that people are very tolerant unless there's a human injury or human death case. There's massive amounts. We had a scientific paper that just came out that showed that 100,000 incidents of conflict are compensated for per year, roughly, by the Indian government. That's higher than any other country in the world. And what the science has shown me is that we have a chronic problem. It's also an indicator that in some places, all hope is not lost. Wildlife is persisting amongst people, and I don't take conflict as a bad sign. It's actually an evidence that there is wildlife still around. And it's a question. What it's also shown me is that we kind of focus on the adults in this community who deal with the economic, health, psychological losses, and that's where the idea to work with kids came around, because I feel rural children living in high conflict parks may have a very different perception of wildlife, and our own kids who grow up in cities have a very different perception of wildlife. So all of that kind of distilled into writing this children's book. So I think science plays a very important role.
Well, apparently, panelists feel I shouldn't be fired from my job. Thank you, guys. But yeah, well,
No, I would, I think I'm not going to
should be
fire
fired.
you. I won't fire you quite yet. But, you made a remark right at the beginning that you had a childhood fear of geckos. But it struck me when I was looking at your book with the illustrations of Prabhupada, the loris looks a whole lot like a gecko to me as well. And in a sense, we can all have our fears. We can be scared of spiders, we can be scared of frogs and all of that. But I think that somehow these stories, these incidents, experiences that we have, help us overcome those fears and also, in a sense, overcome many of the prejudices that we have towards wildlife in that way.
Sure. I think I guess one of my peeves is that far too few scientists actually try to engage with the public in any manner at all, go beyond the scientific papers that they write, let alone fiction, to write popular articles, or take the time to engage with journalists who are writing about their work.
If you did, I wouldn't have a job.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that later. But I did have a segue from a comment that Krithi made. You led me beautifully onto that about how it's really valuable to work with the children. And another provocative question: if our goal was to sort of bring about change, and now I am saying that there's a goal to the writing, should we be sort of putting all of our eggs in the children's basket? I mean, is there, in terms of communicating either through semi-fiction, fiction, non-fiction, if we're using nature writing as an instrument of change, is 80-90% of that change likely to happen with children? So now, if I put on a donor hat, for example, and I've got a pot of money to give away for production of nature writing, should I invest most of that in children's writing? Because from what you said, that's what's going to make the difference.
So I'm putting my eggs in rural children's basket who live on the front lines of conservation, not in my own children who live in the city.
Yes.
So yeah.
To clarify, yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Is that the basket that we should be putting most of our eggs in?
I don't even think I'm out to change anything. I'm just having fun. And I'm trying to communicate that if I can have fun, readers can have fun too. And they should go out and have fun, and it would help. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to change anybody or anything.
That was my line.
No, I think everything should change. I mean, science should change. Science is constantly changing. And when we think of science as this sort of carved in stone, message that is somehow unquestionable and all of that. And the truth is, science is constantly changing and evolving. And I think that that's one of the exciting things about it, is you suddenly realize that something that was an accepted fact 40 years ago is now completely out the window and something else is there. And I think that that kind of change is a part of the stories we tell too, in the sense that I think that if you look at, say, Kipling's Jungle Book, there are certain, I mean, I'm not talking about the Disney version, I'm actually talking about the book itself. There are certain preconceptions, there are certain assumptions about that wildlife at that particular time, a very Victorian view of wildlife. Whereas I think when we write about wildlife, we're not looking at it through the same Victorian lens that way. In a sense, I mean, Janaki, your books look at wildlife through a very familiar lens, in the sense that it's stuff that's coming indoors, it's leopards that are killing your dogs, it's creatures that you're not anthropomorphizing them, as Kipling did. We recognize that anthropomorphizing these animals is not a good idea necessarily. And so then how do we make them interesting?
Oops. My books have talking animals in them.
No. Now you're in trouble. Now you're in serious trouble.
Okay, so sort of as a last closing round, I mean, I think I'd really like to hear what you have to, what your thoughts might be on how, nature writing, can become this much more popular, widespread genre. It seems to me to still be a niche genre, both the nonfiction, but particularly, I think the fiction is very much a niche genre. I mean, if you think of science fiction as a larger genre, or fantasy fiction, it's really as successful as any other genre of fiction. And nature fiction, people who write about conservation, for example, just racy thrillers around conservation. I think there are probably 2 successful authors worldwide that have made money out of it. Do you think there's a time and a place? Do you think at this time in our history there is concern enough about nature and wildlife, about conservation, about the threats that face our planet, that it's something that could be a way of making those connections that we've been talking about? Is nature writing poised for a big leap?
I've been talking too much, but let me just very briefly try and respond to you, and then turn to the others. I think that as a nature writer, you of course write for other people who appreciate nature. But I think there should be, as every writer dreams and hopes, you want to broaden your audience as much as you can. So in a sense, you want to touch a nerve with your readers that may not just be the sort of the crowd that goes to national parks or buys Salim Ali's books again and again and again. And one of the things that I found very challenging but also very rewarding is in many of my books I explore the spirituality of nature as well. And so people who may not be interested in tigers and leopards, if you can give nature its spiritual, you don't have to give nature, you have to draw that spirituality out of nature and be able to make that connection for people. I think then that's the kind of thing that it doesn't get a message across, but it touches a chord with people who might otherwise have no interest in reading about spiders or gaur or whatever else it might be. So I think we have to broaden that audience, and by finding what are the things that will appeal to other people other than ourselves.
I think there's more nature writing compared to a few years ago. Like when you think of M. Krishnan's time, how many people were writing about nature, and look at the number of people writing about nature now. So I think it's happening even without a direct intervention. So I think it also indicates that there are more people reading or wanting to read those kind of books or articles. So I think it's happening.
I think you have to make this fun. It starts with being fun. Conservation can get very depressing, and I think at least children's books and simple fictional novels so make this exciting and fun. And that's you read a book, then you want to go to a zoo and see an animal, then you want to go on a hike. It starts to build that way, and I think fun is the word that comes to mind. So.
Well, fun's a great word to end on. Stephen Alter, Janaki Lenin, Krithi Karanth, all fine naturalists and fine writers. Thank you very much for your thoughts. We'll leave you with the idea that, Krithi let the cat out of the bag. Conservation is depressing, but animals, wildlife, and ecology and being out with nature are fun, and writing about them is fun. And the four of us, certainly plan to continue doing that. Thank you guys again. And thank you all very much.